Welcome to the Page of Crime. Here we talk about true crime events that have taken place. We will go over the evidence and crime and the lives of those involved. On this episode, we are going to go over the life and death of John Palmer, a man who earned the name GoldFinger. Imagine being born into a world devoid of comfort, where survival is the only game you know. This was the world John Palmer was thrown into. In 1950, Palmer entered the world one of 7 children in Solihull, England. A mere 8 miles southeast of Birmingham, this is where Palmer's story began, but his family soon relocated to Richmond Road in Alton. Palmer's early years were spent in a 2-bedroom council house, a setting far removed from the comforts of affluence. His father was absent, leaving his mother to raise 7 children in an environment steeped in poverty. For Palmer, this meant frequent hunger and a wardrobe of hand-me-down clothes. It also meant sharing a bed with his brothers, 3 bodies to a single mattress. The world outside their home was no less challenging. From as young as 5, Palmer would roam the streets, where he was often the target of bullying. Kids would call him names and laugh at his speech, sparking fights that became a regular part of his life. The community offered little in the way of wholesome activities for children, with scant play areas and few parks. Palmer's fascination with local criminals who frequented his home and provided financial support to his mother would begin to shape his future. His first encounter with law enforcement came at the tender age of 8 for stealing. His school years were equally turbulent. As a child, Palmer would attend Chapel Fields Primary School. He was known as the scruffy kid in old hole-ridden clothes who would frequently ask to use the toilet to get out of class to smoke cigarettes. When he was in class, he was considered very naughty and hardly did any work. Despite his teachers' attempts to intervene, even providing him with clean clothes and shoes, his struggles with dyslexia and a growing reputation for fighting followed him to Linden High School. It wasn't long before it was clear that these institutions weren't meant for a boy like him. With dyslexia making reading and writing a struggle, Palmer found himself a frequent target of ridicule. His tattered clothes and scruffy appearance painted a target on his back, and he was often the butt of his classmates' cruel jokes. But Palmer was no pushover. He quickly gained a reputation for his fists rather than his wit. He was a fighter, a protector of the weak, but protection came at a cost. Those he defended often found themselves indebted to him, a fact Palmer was not shy to exploit. His truancy became a matter of routine. He was already engaging in petty theft. As he grew older, his crimes escalated. He formed a crew, a band of like-minded individuals who thrived in the underbelly of society. They targeted the wealthy, raiding stores, burglarizing homes, and selling stolen goods. Violence was their language, and they spoke it fluently. The crew was a reflection of Palmer himself, rough around the edges, but with a keen sense of survival. They were just kids, but the streets had aged them prematurely. Palmer also had a job working delivering newspapers. Even his legitimate job, delivering newspapers, was a cover for his illicit activities. Palmer used it to scout potential targets, providing a steady stream of information to his crew. Eventually, suspicions arose and he lost his job, but it was just a minor setback in a life already veering off track. His focus on money, his reputation as a tough fighter, and his early encounters with crime and the authorities were all signs of the notorious figure he was destined to become. His reputation grew, not from empty threats or hollow words, but from a tangible aura of danger that clung to him like a second skin. Palmer wasn't one for idle chatter. He didn't waste his breath on arguments or petty squabbles. His silence was his power. He would listen, nod, then walk away, leaving any would-be challengers in his wake. Friends from school would often say that Palmer was not someone you'd want to cross paths with during his last few years of school. He carried an aura that was not just intimidating, it was downright terrifying. His peers, once quick to ridicule, now held him in awe, reluctant to cross paths with him. He left school aged 15 in 1965. His days of textbooks and chalkboards were replaced with roof tiles as he joined his brother Malcolm in the roof tiling business. But the life of an everyday tradesman was not his destiny. Palmer would still be involved in petty theft. Palmer's path was paved with stolen goods and the glitter of illicit jewelry. By the age of 16, He started to focus on opening a jewelry shop because he was getting a lot of stolen jewelry and he could use the shop to buy and also resale stolen jewelry. Palmer would always hear about the criminals that were feared by many. He would watch them and learn from them. The criminal underworld was not just a source of income for young Palmer, but also a world of inspiration. He found his role models in the feared crime families of London, the Richardsons from the south and the notorious Cray twins from the east. Their ruthless methods of handling business matters fascinated Palmer, and he began to emulate their torture tactics. Palmer's initiation into the realm of firearms came when he became a runner for a local gang. In the heart of Birmingham, at the age of 17, Palmer's first jewelry shop was born. It was a beacon for thieves, a place where stolen jewelry could be sold without question. The business thrived, and by the time he was 19, Palmer's pockets were swollen with over £100,000. His mother was the first beneficiary, receiving a home just outside of Birmingham. His name echoed through the underworld like a chilling wind. Palmer's shop was not just a place of business, but a fortress, guarded by his loyal heavies. Most business of Palmer's would take place at his shop. He expanded his empire, becoming a feared loan shark and starting a protection racket. He would have multiple businesses paying protection. If you owed Palmer money, a visit from his men was inevitable, and it was a visit you would dread. However, no criminal goes unchallenged. At the age of 23 in 1973, Palmer was arrested and charged with fraud. His new home became Birmingham's Winson Green prison. Inside the prison walls, Palmer kept to himself, spending his time honing his physical strength and maintaining a strict fitness regime. He was no stranger to a fight, and prison was no exception. While Palmer was behind bars, his jewelry shop in Birmingham was taken over by a gang of older criminals. The sting of betrayal was even sharper when Palmer discovered that his own father was behind the takeover. Some weeks later, Palmer would go on trial for fraud. He would receive a 6-month suspended sentence. Upon his release, with a bitter taste of treachery lingering, he decided to start afresh in Bristol, leaving behind the city of Birmingham. Plus, Palmer knew if he bumped into his father, he would have to hurt him. Once in Bristol, where John Palmer moved into a modest flat and quickly opened a jewellery store, a clandestine front for his illicit trade in stolen goods. It was in the balmy summer of 1974 when he encountered the alluring Marnie Ryan. Their connection was immediate and intense. They spent nearly every day together, and John wooed her with countless dates. Despite his best efforts to keep his shady dealings a secret, Marnie sensed something was amiss. John's suspicious handling of calls and his frequent departures to conduct business in private could not escape her keen eye. A few months into their relationship, Marnie discovered she was pregnant with their daughter, Ella. The couple quickly tied the knot in 1975. By this point, by the age of 25, John was well on his way to his first million. His empire began to expand when he ventured into business with Garth Chappell, opening a second-hand car dealership. This establishment served as a front for other criminal activities. Before long, Terence Edward James Patch joined their ranks, and the trio began working together. John's obsession with money was evident to those around him. Despite his lack of formal education, he was adamant about not dying broke. His associations with several criminal families in the area were instrumental in his rise. They taught him how to launder money, move illegal goods without detection, and keep his wealth hidden. John preferred to maintain a low profile. However, when an associate was shot dead in Bristol's city centre, informants began to drop his name to the police. Fearing criminals were giving his name to police, John threatened potential informants with torture. These weren't empty threats, as some unfortunate individuals found out. His reputation soared in the criminal world and his businesses flourished. John, along with Garth Chappell and Terence Patch, opened Scadlin Limited, a gold and jewellery business in Bedminster, south of the river. In a world where literacy is taken for granted, Palmer turned his inability to read and write into a unique tool for his criminal undertakings. Rather than penning down notes, he relied on a tape recorder, capturing every conversation. This method, however, didn't sit well with other criminals, who saw it as a potential liability, especially if the police were to ever get those tapes. Yet, Palmer persisted, keeping his recorder hidden in his pocket, aware of the power these tapes held over those who crossed him. Driven by an insatiable desire for wealth, Palmer found himself drawn to the world of classic supercars. An associate had once whispered in his ear about the potential profits hidden in these beautiful machines. Taking his advice, Palmer purchased a Jensen Interceptor, a car he would occasionally drive but mostly keep hidden away in a garage waiting for its value to escalate. During the mid-70s, amid a wave of corruption permeating the police force, Palmer found allies in the most unlikely of places. He surrounded himself with police officers willing to share insider information and turn a blind eye to his illicit activities, all for a small fee. Despite his criminal activities, Palmer was a man who deeply cared for his family. He went to great lengths to protect them, shielding them from his business dealings and dangerous associates. His circle was small, his trust limited. Anyone who dared to cross his family would face the wrath of Palmer's crew, a visit that usually ended in pain and regret. As Palmer's reputation grew, his money grew. He began to indulge in luxury holidays with his family. It was during one of these trips that he stumbled upon the concept of timeshares, where holiday homes would be shared between owners. He saw potential in these shared holiday homes, but believed they would only thrive in warmer climates. In 1978, Palmer and his family relocated to Tenerife to launch a timeshare business, settling in a penthouse in Playa de las Americas. Despite the distance, Palmer kept a watchful eye on his UK business ventures, flying back and forth. However, in 1980, trouble found its way to Palmer. He was arrested and charged with credit fraud on furniture by providing false references, along with his business partner Garth Chappell. They would both receive a 6-month suspended prison sentence. It would be around this time he would meet up and become good friends with Kenneth Noy, who would reside in Kent. Kenneth would bring Palmer gold to smelt down and turn into ingots so they could be sold on. They would do this for some time and generate loads of cash. Him and Kenneth would spend a lot during this time, which made them stand out even more. Multiple properties were brought, cars, fancy clothes, the lot. In 1983, Palmer lived with his family in an isolated, large, detached home called Battlefields in Lansdowne, Bath. With stables attached to the side of the home, now Palmer couldn't have empty stables, so he purchased 4 horses. Him and the family loved the home. Soon after, Marnie would become pregnant with their second child, Sarah. He would also build a smelter made of huge bricks and corrugated iron. It took just a couple of days for him to build, and was tucked in behind a stable. John never saw any need to hide it. He was proud of the smelter. On a chilly November morning in 1983, 6 armed men stormed a warehouse near London's Heathrow Airport, operated by the security company, Brinks Matt. Using inside information, the violent men, armed with firearms, would make entry to the building using one of the security guards, Anthony Black. The gang overpowered the guards and disabled the security systems. They then proceeded to pour petrol over the warehouse staff, threatening to set them alight if they did not reveal the combination for the vault. The staff complied, leaving the robbers free to make off with their golden bounty. Yet the thieves had a problem. They had expected to find £1 million worth of foreign currency. Instead, they had stumbled upon 3 tons of gold, more than 6,000 gold bars and diamonds, a total value of £46 million, the equivalent to £124 million today. Once the thieves had loaded their van and left, one of the staff managed to break free of his handcuffs and alert the police of the incident. When it happened, it became the biggest robbery in history, worldwide. One of the people whose help they enlisted was John Palmer. The gold was traceable, each bar etched with a unique serial number. They needed a way to melt the gold down, to make it untraceable and saleable. Noy and Brian Reeder, 2 of whom were connected to the robbers, approached Palmer with a proposition. They offered him a 25% cut to recycle the stolen gold. It was an offer too lucrative for Palmer to refuse. John Palmer began smelting gold in the garden of his West Country home. The gold, stolen from the heist, had been secretly transported there by his fellow criminals Mickey McAvoy and Brian Reeder. The smelted gold was then smuggled out of Britain, cleverly concealed within lorries and on private planes, only to be re-imported as legitimate gold with the required documentation. It was a scheme that worked beautifully for a while. The criminals even claimed back 15% VAT on their illicit deals. But like all ill-gotten gains, it was a house of cards waiting to collapse. It wouldn't be long before arrests were made. Mickey McAvoy and Brian Robinson were arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years for their role in the gold heist. The gold ingots, as Marnie recalls, were beautiful. They glistened and were perfectly formed. I saw about 10 bars at the coach house, but genuinely thought nothing of it as we were getting bagfuls of valuable jewellery coming in every day. She would also state, like everything else, the gold was shoved in with all the scrap. John would be dubbed a mastermind, but as I saw with my own eyes, this was not rocket science. He just carried on doing what he always had done, mixing everything together with the unwanted jewellery. However, 2 days after the robbery, a tip-off from a couple who noticed Palmer smelting metal in his garden shed, but the police never acted on the tip. By 1984, Palmer had smelted down approximately £10 million worth of gold bullions. Money flowed like a river. But the tide turned on January 26, 1985. John Fordham and Neil Murphy, dressed in camouflage and wearing balaclavas, 2 officers staking out a mansion belonging to Noy, noticed some suspicious activity. As they made their way a bit closer, they would see Noy having a conversation with Brian Reeder. Their investigation was abruptly cut short when they were noticed by Noy's Rottweilers. The 2 officers would make a break for it to not break cover. Murphy would get away, assuming Fordham was behind him. Fordham was stabbed multiple times by Noy in his garden, while Murphy managed to escape. Murphy would go back once he realized Fordham wasn't behind him. But once he returned, he would find Fordham bleeding on the ground. This act of violence led to a police raid on Noy's mansion, where they found evidence tying him and Brian Reeder to the gold heist, including gold bars stashed in the premises. Both were promptly arrested. Brian Reeder and Kenneth Noy were arrested for the death of Mr. Fordham and for conspiracy to handle the stolen bullions. The police, in their relentless pursuit, raided Scadlin's North Street location, a seemingly innocuous smelting firm. What they uncovered was a sophisticated operation designed to launder the stolen gold. John Palmer had been enlisted to melt down the bullion, mixing it with junk jewellery, copper and other scrap metals, effectively erasing its identity. The gold was then resold, the profits funding the lavish lifestyles of the criminal accomplices. After looking into the company's records, they would find they had been falsified. Palmer's business associates, Garth Chappell and Terence Patch, would not enjoy their ill-gotten gains for long as they were arrested. Just days before the police raid on his home, Palmer and his family fled to Tenerife, Spain. There, he learnt about the raid. The reception staff would tell Marnie and John that a serious call has come through and for them to contact back home. Here, John would learn that his name is all over the news and how law enforcement are looking for him regarding the Brinks-Mat gold. But Palmer was not a man to be easily rattled. He brushed off the news and continued his holiday, promising to deal with the issue upon his return to the UK. Back home, the police searched Palmer's property, seizing everything from a brand new Range Rover Vogue to gold bullions hidden under a settee cushion and some firearms. Yet they failed to locate a safe buried beneath the cobbles, missing a treasure trove of precious jewellery. In Tenerife, Palmer was already laying the groundwork for his next venture. He made connections with influential figures such as Charles Taylor and began exploring the diamond trade in Africa. While Palmer was on the island, he made connections with as much powerful people as he could. He also needed people to notify him if any law enforcement came looking for him for the Brinks-Mat robbery back in the UK. Meanwhile, he sent his family back to the UK and began an affair with his accountant he hired, Christine Ketley, who he referred to as his Tenerife wife. In the heart of the Canary Islands, near Playa de las Americas, Palmer and Charles Taylor were plotting their grand scheme, a timeshare resort on the island village in Tenerife. The goal was not only to create a lucrative business venture, but also to launder Palmer's questionable cash. They would meet with businessmen and banks for funding. Meanwhile, across the waters in London, Brian Reeder and Kenneth Noy found themselves at the centre of a courtroom drama. Accused of the murder of John Fordham, they were staring down the barrel of a life sentence. But fate, or rather a jury believing in self-defence, set them free. Their freedom, however, was short-lived. Soon they were back in the dock, this time for their involvement in the notorious Brinks-Mat robbery. In May 1986, the verdict, guilty for the Brinks-Mat bullion robbery. Kenneth Noy now faced 14 years. Brian Reeder received 9 years. Noy's response was unexpected, a curse upon the jury, hoping they all die from cancer. As the drama unfolded in London, Palmer rapidly became involved in the drugs trade. Spain was a crucial link in the supply of cocaine to wealthy European markets. Palmer was perfectly placed to help solve the traffickers' laundering problems by using his legitimate businesses in Tenerife and elsewhere in Spain to wash criminal cash. He even had the audacity to brag to undercover TV reporter Roger Cook about his capacity to launder £60 million a year. Passport issues and an impending eviction from Tenerife forced him to flee to Brazil. Palmer knew going back to the UK wouldn't be a good idea just yet, but his escape was short-lived. Arrested at the airport due to an expired passport, he found himself in the local Brazilian prison. He wouldn't be in any longer than a few nights, as his lawyer would get him out. But that came with a price, a hefty $10,000 and a one-way ticket back to London. Upon his return to Heathrow Airport, Palmer was immediately arrested for his connection to the Brinks Mats robbery. Defended by the pricey Cuban cigar-smoking Henry Milner, he was sent to Brixton Prison on remand until his court hearing. In 1987, Palmer stood trial as an accomplice to the Brinks Mat robbery by disposing of the gold by melting it down. Despite admitting to melting down gold bars in his garden, he vehemently denied knowledge of their stolen origin. A crucial error the police made against Palmer regarding a piece of paper with Noy's number written down, supposedly linking Palmer to Noy, played in his favour. Palmer, being illiterate, could not have written down the name and number. A handwriting analysis would also confirm this, making it look like the police had never found it there or they placed it there. This cast doubt on the police's evidence. The jury also believed his claim of not knowing the origins of the precious metal, and Palmer was acquitted. He would walk out of the Old Bailey a free man. Celebrating his freedom, Palmer blew kisses from the dock to the jury of 12. Pictures after his acquittal show Palmer and his wife Marnie, then 37, celebrating in the courtyard of their home, with an Easter egg clutched in her hands. Despite the fact he had a shop in Bedminster, in Bristol, that bought and sold gold jewellery, and also laundered stolen valuables. Among these were the gold bullions from the infamous Brinks Mat robbery. This audacious act earned him his nickname, GoldFinger. But not everyone was pleased with Palmer's actions. Some of the convicted criminals involved in the Brinks Mat robbery were Mickey McAvoy and Kenneth Noy, along with a security guard named Anthony Black. Palmer's business partners, Chappell and Patch, didn't escape the fallout. They were sentenced to 10 years for their involvement in the heist. Meanwhile, Palmer seemed untouched, despite the overwhelming evidence linking him to the crime. This led many in the criminal underworld, including Kenneth Noy, to label Palmer as a grass or informant, because there was so much evidence linking him to the others who got sentenced, as well as being found with the gold bullions after a police search of his property. After a 1987 trial at the Old Bailey, Palmer's life took another turn. Exposed in a newspaper revealing his affair with Christine Ketley left his wife Marnie furious. Palmer's response? He hopped on a private plane at Bristol Airport and flew to Tenerife to focus on his numerous businesses. On the Canary Islands, Palmer, alongside Christine Ketley, concentrated on selling timeshare apartments, a venture that would involve fraud, money laundering, drugs, and firearms. Palmer also opened restaurants, shops, and even a hotel on the island. However, as his business grew, so did the number of complaints. Palmer had a unique way of dealing with disgruntled customers. He employed heavies to intimidate them, and those who didn't take the hint received a visit that ensured their complaints ceased. Despite the growing tension, Palmer remained undeterred. He wasn't about to let no one slow down or stop what he had going on. He was set on maintaining his empire, no matter the cost. Tenerife soon became a haven for retired and active criminals, many of whom were involved in similar ventures as Palmer. Yet back in England, Palmer's reputation was taking a hit. The criminal underworld was rife with rumours of him being an informant, a rat. Those that were involved in the Brinks Mats robbery were upset with Palmer because they believe he took most of the bullions and used them to start his main business, to become a multimillionaire. A man who bathed in opulence, with an estimated fortune of £100 million at this point. His wealth, amassed from a blend of criminal escapades and legal ventures, money laundering, fraud, racketeering, you name it, Palmer had a hand in it. But it wasn't all under-the-table dealings. His legitimate businesses, including a water park, became a tourist attraction, raking in a legitimate profit. Palmer's assets were nothing short of lavish. A private jet, whisking him between England and Tenerife, sat in a private hangar in Bristol. A yacht, a fleet of expensive cars, and additional homes scattered across prime locations. And let's not forget his taste for Savile Row suits. But beneath this sparkling veneer of wealth and power, Palmer was a man feared by many. The locals would call him the Godfather. His wealth and influence were such that he had a network of corrupt officers and officials at his disposal, feeding him information and turning a blind eye to his illicit activities. Palmer knew everything that was going on in Tenerife. Despite the fear he instilled, Palmer was a man who knew how to work the system. But unknown to Palmer, there were designated officers set out to watch Palmer's movements and watch all his known businesses. He would even get involved with another woman, Saskia, who he would get pregnant, but she would end up leaving to go back to Germany, where she was from, to have the child. At the heart of his security detail was Mohammed Derba, originally from Lebanon, who would join Palmer in 1989, who he would meet on a trip to Africa. A man whose loyalty was as unwavering as his ruthlessness. Derba led a team of enforcers, or clumpers as they called them, very tough and aggressive young men. These men, hardened from their criminal pasts, were willing to do whatever necessary to protect Palmer's interests, and were paid extremely well. Other people on the island would set up timeshare businesses near him, and Palmer would send his guys, or clumpers as they were called, over there to attack their workers, which sometimes included shootings, and then end up charging the timeshare owners a fee for running the timeshare on Palmer's Island, as he liked to call it. If that didn't work, people would, let's just say, disappear. In the early 90s, Palmer's wealth skyrocketed to an estimated £200 million. A significant turning point in his life was the birth of his son James, who he would have with Christine Ketley, a child he knew he had to keep hidden from his wife Marnie. The arrival of his child, however, did not deter him from his unlawful ventures. Palmer was laundering money not only for notorious drug dealers but also for seemingly legitimate businessmen seeking to evade their tax obligations. His operation in Tenerife was flourishing, but it was also attracting unwanted attention. Around the same time, thousands of British holidaymakers were falling victim to Palmer's timeshare scam. He was selling a dream, holiday homes in the sun-soaked island of Tenerife. But the dream would soon turn into a nightmare. These homes either didn't exist or were sold to multiple unsuspecting buyers, who were then strong-armed into paying additional money. Refusal to comply meant they were denied access to the property they had already paid for. It was a scheme that robbed many of their life savings and left a trail of broken dreams. But as the number of victims grew, so did the pressure on authorities to act. Palmer's web of corruption and intimidation had worked for a while, with many people fearing him for his enormous wealth and the corrupt officials he had in his pocket. But the law enforcement on the island was not entirely compromised. Certain officers, undeterred and committed to justice, were quietly observing Palmer's activities and his known businesses. The law was slowly but surely closing in on Palmer. By 1991, Palmer's criminal activities had caught up with him. He needed to return to the UK for business, but he would find out through his lawyer that there was a warrant for his arrest back in the UK over his timeshare business. He returned to face his legal troubles. Palmer took his chance and flew back to the UK on his private jet. He went straight to Bristol and to his Battlefields home where Marnie was living with his children. Within a few days, the police would turn up to Battlefields with an arrest warrant. In court, Palmer managed to evade serious consequences. He would receive an 18-month suspended sentence for a mortgage fraud with some of his timeshare victims. He had to pay back a mere £14,000. Palmer would stay in the UK for about a year. Police knew he was linked to crimes on Tenerife, and Palmer wanted them to believe he was done with crime and wanted to be at home with his family. However, in 1993, Brinks Matt won an asset-freezing injunction against him, forcing him to pay a hefty sum to loss adjusters acting for the security firm. Another massive payment followed, draining him of another £3 million. Yet, even these financial setbacks barely dented Palmer's pocket, estimated at around £350 million. Meanwhile, in Tenerife, Palmer's criminal activities were under intense investigation. Spanish police linked him to a sprawling network of crimes, including swindles, protection rackets, extortion, death threats, and violent attacks. His associations with the Russian mafia and the Colombian cartel further painted a picture of a ruthless criminal empire. There were countless violent attacks on the streets of Tenerife, blamed on his associates, and Palmer himself often wore body armor. In a turf war between rival timeshare operators, cars were set on fire and properties attacked, stabbings, shootings, and some of those incidents leading to murder. Yet it was his timeshare operation that brought him the most attention. The scam left as many as 20,000 victims out of pocket, attracting the ire of the public and the media. Many of his victims, often elderly, spoke of their experiences, painting a grim picture of Palmer's ruthless operation. On a chilly morning in 1994, notorious criminal Kenneth Noy walked free from jail, but freedom had a different meaning for him. He would dive back into the murky waters of the criminal underworld. Roger Cook, the famed investigative journalist, would air his hard-hitting television show, The Cook Report. Cook sought to expose Palmer's illicit activities by setting him up in a sting operation. He would set up Palmer by making it seem as if he was going to meet some big drug dealers to discuss how to launder their money. This would all be recorded unknown to Palmer. Cook would eventually approach Palmer, sensing the trap. He promptly left the scene, retreating to the sun-kissed shores of Tenerife. However, he couldn't evade Cook for long. Upon his return to Bristol airport, he was ambushed by Cook and a horde of reporters, peppering him with probing questions about his illegal activities. But Palmer remained tight-lipped, revealing nothing. But media wasn't the only problem brewing for Palmer. Even the American authorities, the DEA, would get involved in trying to take down Palmer because of his connection to the Colombian cartel that the DEA was already working on taking down. In 1995, a falling out with a business associate on Tenerife would soon spiral into a violent feud. The associate, eager to muscle in on Palmer's lucrative timeshare business and money laundering operation, sparked a series of violent encounters. The tranquil island was suddenly the backdrop for a spate of stabbings and shootings. In a particularly gruesome turn of events, 6 of Palmer's henchmen were arrested for attempted murder. They had cornered the business associate and left him in a dire state. These arrests signaled the beginning of the end for Palmer's stranglehold over the local police force. His influence was waning, and the noose was beginning to tighten. By the end of 1995, the conflict took a dangerous turn. An attempt was made on Palmer's life. As he stepped out of his car to enter his home, bullets whizzed through the air, aimed squarely at him, but luck was on his side. Caught wearing a bulletproof vest, Palmer escaped with minor injuries. Police from the UK would soon reach out to Palmer, urging him to discuss a pressing issue. Initially skeptical, believing everyone was out to get him, Palmer eventually agreed to meet. 2 officers met him at a pub and delivered a chilling warning. There was a hit out on him orchestrated by a prominent underworld boss. It wasn't a question of if, but when. This revelation agitated Palmer, but not for reasons one might expect. It wasn't the threat on his life that irked him. He'd heard such threats before. The frustration stemmed from his inability to act. The police had warned him, and any retaliation could link him to the crime, drawing unwanted attention. The underworld had turned its back on Palmer, and he was left to face the music. Tenerife in the mid-90s. The island was a playground for the criminals, retired and active with one man, Palmer, controlling most of the businesses. Around this time, he would now be working with Florence Robinson, who was known as Flo, who would be managing the timeshare company, and her husband Billy Robinson. Always a step ahead, Palmer conceived a brothel, and used the prostitutes to keep their ears open and pass back any information that they had heard from rivals. In 1996, the Gangland boss was, at one point, one of Britain's richest criminals, joint with the Queen on the Sunday Times rich list. At the same time, Kenneth Noy was making headlines with a road rage incident with another driver, Stephen Cameron, that was driving with his girlfriend, when Noy attacked him, stabbing him, and leaving him to die on the road. He would then get rid of the vehicle he was in, as the attack was in broad daylight and seen by many passerbys. Noy, in a panic, turned to Palmer for help, who, oblivious to Noy's crime at this point, facilitated his escape to Spain. Once in Spain, Palmer would use Durba to deal with Noy, helping him find a place to lay low. A week later, Palmer would start to hear about the murder and person responsible as it made the news. All the while, Palmer was dealing with a new threat, the Russian mafia, who were expanding their operations on the island. As if the island wasn't already a melting pot of criminals, the Russian mafia decided to join the party. The ruthless, well-armed Russian mafia, with their numbers, made their presence known in Tenerife, setting up timeshares and expanding them just like Palmer. They were a force to be reckoned with, and Palmer was well aware of this. Ever the strategist, Palmer decided to meet with them before they could make a move on his empire. Instead of going to war, which could lead to him losing everything, he chose to negotiate. He gave up 50% of his timeshare business to the Russians. It was a calculated move. He was already laundering millions of pounds by this time, but he knew he had to keep the Russians satisfied. Palmer also saw an opportunity to offload his troublesome cocaine business to the Russians. He presented it as a favor, distancing himself from the Colombians he'd grown to despise. But even with these strategic moves, the criminal landscape of Tenerife was changing rapidly. As Tenerife became a hotbed for criminals from all corners of the world, Palmer felt the walls closing in. The island, once his criminal paradise, was now teeming with a dangerous cocktail of Eastern European gangsters, the Italian mafia, and Colombians. Each group, ruthless in their own right, was elbowing their way into the lucrative trades of drugs, money laundering, and the sex industry. It was a volatile situation that threatened to explode at any moment. Palmer, the cunning entrepreneur that he was, saw the writing on the wall. Tenerife was no longer a safe haven, but a ticking time bomb. During 1997, his keen instincts led him to look elsewhere for sanctuary. France, a place he was familiar with from his business trips and a place he had grown to love. He decided it was time to pack up and start anew amidst the vineyards and chateaux of the French countryside. So he went on to purchase a chateau in France, with a portfolio that included resorts, apartments and bars all around Tenerife, and still had millions to launder and was stuck with the Russians. He needed a break from the island. He jetting back to Kent, only to be greeted by the cold handcuffs of the law upon landing. The charges? Conspiracy to defraud with a timeshare business. He and his companion, Christine Ketley, were arrested on charges of conspiracy to defraud with their timeshare business. They were held in custody overnight, facing court the following day. In an unexpected twist, however, the duo were granted bail, much to the astonishment of many. With the trial looming, Palmer returned to Tenerife, given the green light by the courts due to legitimate business he had to attend to. He was keen to tie up any loose ends that might further incriminate him. In 1998, as Palmer was trying to cover his tracks, his associate Kenneth Noy was arrested while eating in a Spanish restaurant for the road rage killing. Most notably, in 1999, his relationship with Durbar soured, sparking a bloody rivalry between the two. Meanwhile, the authorities were closing in. A joint task force comprising of British and Spanish agents was established to monitor Palmer's every move. Wiretaps, surveillance, shadowing of his associates, they were pulling out all the stops. Every phone call, every meeting, every transaction was under scrutiny. His every move was watched, his every word listened to. Even the DEA got involved, deploying the same team that took down Pablo Escobar. The walls were closing in on Palmer, and he could feel it. With his back against the wall, Palmer sought help from a notorious lawyer, Giovanni Di Stefano. Known for his dealings with the underworld, Di Stefano offered a risky strategy. Palmer should represent himself in court, a daunting task given Palmer's illiteracy. Yet he was willing to memorize everything. To bolster his defense, he also enlisted the services of QC John Matthews, an old ally from the Brink-Matt case and killing of Fordham in Noyes Garden. As the trial loomed, Palmer played for time, doing everything he could to delay proceedings. He even broke his silence, speaking to a journalist to air his side of the story. He vehemently denied any association with Kenneth Noy, dismissed his involvement in the Brink-Matt robbery, and downplayed the customer complaints about his timeshare business, saying everyone complains about something, but they were never major complaints. The journalist would then say a few of the customers claimed they were forced to the bank to withdraw money, which of course Palmer denied, and anything to do with the sales part of the business he put on his sales team. He painted himself as a victim, not a villain. In 2000, after serving 20 years in long-lasting prison, McAvoy and Brian Robinson would be released months apart, and they still wanted their gold bullions. Meanwhile, Kenneth Noy would be sentenced to life for the road rage killing. Palmer's ruthless behavior and criminal activities made him a target. He was labeled a snitch, a traitor in the underworld. Enemies lurked in every corner, and hits were being placed on him. His own former associates turned against him, and rivals sought to claim his turf. The pressure was mounting, and Palmer was feeling the heat. Adding to his woes was journalist Roger Cook, who was relentless in his pursuit to expose Palmer's criminal activities. When Cook released a TV show about Palmer, it was the last straw. In a desperate attempt to silence Cook, Palmer ordered a hit on him. The plan, however, backfired spectacularly. The hired hitman turned out to be a police informant, and the plot was revealed to the police, who promptly informed Cook. In 2001, Palmer found himself alongside Christine Ketley, standing trial at the Old Bailey, charged with masterminding the largest timeshare fraud on record. Over 20,000 people had been swindled out of millions of pounds. The prosecution built a compelling case, presenting evidence of Palmer's elaborate operation and his use of thugs for intimidation. Many victims came forward to provide evidence against him. Police would come forward stating that Palmer was also involved in other criminal activities, drug trafficking, money laundering, firearms, as well as being involved with the Russian mafia. Palmer tried to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. Palmer did ask Flo to attend court of his behalf as she was running the timeshare business at his resort, but Billy Robinson knew how serious this case was and didn't want his wife to get caught and possibly sent to jail herself, so he didn't allow it. He was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in HMP Belmarsh in London. Ketley would receive a 2-year suspended sentence, meaning she would serve this time at home instead of going to prison. While in prison, Palmer was ordered to pay £33 million in cash and assets to the state and give £2.7 million in compensation to his victims within 3 years, or face an additional 11 years in prison. He managed to dodge the £33 million payment on a technicality, but still ended up paying around £4 million in compensation to his victims. Durbar was arrested and briefly imprisoned by a Spanish judge in connection with timeshare activity, but he was never charged. Despite the confines of prison, Palmer continued his scheming ways, bribing prison officers to smuggle in cannabis and mobile phones. He even hired inmates as his personal security after being attacked and robbed early into his sentence. Some say the attack happened because he already had Rat hanging over his name, plus they didn't respect the fact he was scamming mostly pensioners for the life savings. In 2002, he would be relocated to Long Lartin Prison in Worcestershire. Despite his confinement, he allegedly managed to keep his businesses flourishing in Tenerife. The police, however, weren't fooled. They kept a close ear to his calls, listening to money transfers, discussions, and even plans to fund robberies. A few of these plots were intercepted, with officers ambushing the robbers before they could strike. This stirred the pot in the criminal underworld, sparking suspicions that this man was turning them in. Meanwhile, the police were busy tracing his money trail, linking him to around 50 companies across various countries. It was suspected these were fronts for money laundering. As Palmer's influence waned, his enemies began to rise, threatening his empire. The world outside prison was changing. Palmer's rivals were gaining ground and his empire was crumbling. Among those rivals was Mohammed Durbar. Durbar was building his own timeshare empire, working with those who Palmer considered foes. This would really agitate Palmer. While locked up in prison, he was also questioned about other crimes he may have had connections to, but he always remained silent on those topics. He would also make sure his wife Marnie and his Tenerife wife Ketley were looked after financially. Meanwhile, Saskia, the German student and mother to Palmer's child, was not sitting idle. She was now living in London. She took Palmer to court and the judgment was in her favour. Palmer had to part with not only 2 of his homes, but also a hefty sum of £100,000 per year. After 4 years behind bars, he was out and would to stay with Christine Ketley at her home in Essex. Over in Tenerife, the sunny island was witnessing a power shift. The Russians were taking control, leaving Palmer's associates scrambling to hold on to what was left of his timeshare business. Amidst all this, Palmer faced more lawsuits and declared bankruptcy, with debts amounting to £3.9 million. Despite his attempts to lay low, Palmer was a marked man. His past was catching up to him. Even as Palmer tried to retreat into the background, the police, relentless as ever, kept him under their watchful eyes. They believed, and rightly so, that he was still involved in the underworld he had once ruled. Meanwhile, the scene in Tenerife was turning grim. His former allies, Billy Robinson and Flo, who had went on to start their own timeshare, were kidnapped and brutally tortured. Flo's lifeless body was found discarded by the road while Billy was discovered in the back seat of his car. The pressure was mounting on his remaining associates. European gangs were tightening their grip, forcing many to turn to the police for protection. In their desperation, they started singing, spilling secrets, and implicating Palmer. One of Palmer's Russian associates met a violent end in France, leading to the Russians seizing control of his timeshares. In the end, Palmer was left alone, his empire in ruins. In 2007, Spanish authorities had been closing in on him, gathering information on Palmer, trying to get him to pay for the crimes he had committed on their island. Palmer, feeling the heat, decided to sell off most of his business in Tenerife to another London crime family. This decision, however, was not without its precautions. Palmer recorded the conversations with the family as he didn't really trust them 100%, in which they discussed their own criminal activities, a safety net for himself should things go awry. Later that same year, Palmer would fly back to Tenerife with Christine Ketley to tie up some loose ends before fully moving away from the island. The Spanish authorities, however, were relentless. Upon his return to Tenerife, Palmer was arrested on multiple charges, ranging from money laundering and drug trafficking to assault. He was flown to Madrid's Valdemoro prison. Soon, Palmer would stand in front of the judge, and he would let him know about all the crimes that he was involved in, and how they have been investigating him for over 10 years. The judge also made it clear that Christine Ketley was willingly involved and knew what was going on because many properties in the UK and Tenerife were in her name. This is a claim Ketley would deny. A few weeks later, Ketley would be let go from prison. Some say this is because Palmer was giving the authorities information in return for her release. Palmer would spend 2 years on remand in Spain. He was then released on bail after paying £100,000 and had to remain at home until his trial date. He returned to Essex, to a detached house with a large garden in South Weald, a rural settlement in Brentwood. Yet even in retirement, Palmer's influence was far from over. Palmer continued to dabble in criminal activities on a smaller scale. He had a few legitimate businesses he would continue to maintain. He wouldn't leave the house too much as he was still very paranoid that people had it out for him and probably still wanted him gone. It is said one of the reasons Palmer wasn't killed off was because a lot of criminals knew about the tapes he had, as he would record conversations for him to listen back to. But many things were mentioned on these tapes, including murders and who was responsible. He would sneak out on certain nights to collect money he has stashed around in fields. In the spring of 2015, Palmer's life took a sudden turn when he suffered a heart attack. His son James and Ketley found him in distress and hastily drove him to the hospital. After an intense emergency surgery, Palmer was in recovery. A few days later, while recovering in hospital, the report of a robbery at Hatton Garden struck the news that had taken place stealing very expensive gems. His secret safety deposit box had been stolen. Palmer was left in a state of shock, as the tapes he had stored as a safety net were now gone. As Palmer was recovering, he received a nerve-wracking call from the robbers to meet up. The robbers, aware of their newfound power, decided to exploit the situation. Their audacious demand: a hefty sum of £1 million a month, an amount they believed Palmer could afford given his suspected fortune of over £100 million. This unsettling development was a clear sign Palmer was losing control, compelling him to drastically upgrade his home security. He could feel the tides turning against him, his sense of safety slipping away. In May 2015, Palmer was charged again in Spain with fraud, firearms possession and money laundering, and 10 others, including his ex-associate Richard Cashman. They were all due to stand trial in Tenerife. 65 and suffering ill health, he faced up to 15 years in prison. On June 24, 2015, Palmer's fears materialized in the most horrific way. On this fateful summer day, Palmer observed a young man digging near his property, close to where 2 others had been digging the previous day. He dismissed it as yet another police surveillance, a common occurrence in his life. As the afternoon sun blazed high in the sky, Palmer was captured on camera riding his quad in his backyard around 4 p.m. He made a call, then walked out of camera range. Upon returning, he was seen burning some paperwork before heading to an area hidden from his security cameras. The watcher through the fence chose this moment to strike. The assassin leapt over the fence and fired 3 shots into Palmer's chest. As Palmer fell and tried to crawl away, the assailant stood over him, firing 3 more bullets into his back. The brutal assassination was over in moments, leaving Palmer fatally wounded. The assassin would then jump back over the fence and disappear. Despite his desperate attempt to reach his house, Palmer collapsed and died. The frantic barking of his Rottweilers would lead to his lifeless body being discovered by his girlfriend, Christine, and his son, James. The pair were inside the house but didn't hear gunshots, suggesting a silencer was used. They didn't even notice he had been shot at this time. The gunshot wounds, small and seemingly insignificant, were overlooked. The paramedics and police initially attributed Palmer's death to cardiac arrest, given he'd recently undergone keyhole surgery to his chest. The news outlets would report the death of John Palmer, saying it was due to natural causes. At this point, the hitman must have thought he committed the perfect murder. It was not until June 29th. During a post-mortem examination at Basildon Hospital, Essex, pathologist Benjamin Swift unveiled a shocking revelation. Palmer had not passed peacefully, but had been shot 6 times, finding wounds in his chest and back. The discovery of this truth was delayed due to an unfortunate misinterpretation. The bullet holes marking Palmer's body were mistaken for heart surgery scars, leading Essex police to initially conclude a natural cause of death. However, the realization that the crime bore all the hallmarks of a contract killing sent shockwaves through the force and catapulted the case to the forefront of their investigations. Scotland Yard was furious when they heard this news. They now say the crime had all the hallmarks of a contract killing. The investigation into Palmer's death was met with immediate obstacles. CCTV footage from Palmer's home showed him in the garden at the time of his murder, but the entrance used by the killer was conveniently out of sight from the cameras. This indicated the hitman was aware of the property's security, pointing towards a calculated, premeditated crime. They would find a bullet casing and a hole that looked to be recently made into the fence. Palmer was no stranger to the law. He was under the surveillance of the Serious and Organised Crime Agency for 16 years, making him one of Britain's most wanted criminals. His criminal past, including involvement in high-profile heists that earned him the nickname GoldFinger and Timeshare fraud. The delay in identifying Palmer's true cause of death was met with criticism. Former Met Police Commander for Special Operations, Roy Ram, who retired in 1996 and is now a consultant on crime and investigations, points out, "That golden hour when you're looking at witnesses, forensics, CCTV, all the stuff that can help you solve a crime quickly was wasted." Former Metropolitan Police Chief John O'Connor voiced his concerns to The Sun, stating that when someone as notorious as John Palmer is discovered dead on your patch, then surely it's common sense to be absolutely sure of the facts about how he died. Detectives would be days behind in the investigation and may have completely lost the crime scene, he added. 2 officers from Essex Police, who were first on the scene, were later disciplined for failing to spot he had been shot. Palmer's partner, Christine Ketley, shared chilling details about the days leading up to Palmer's death. She claimed he was stalked, with the killer watching him through a spy hole in the garden fence of his home before striking. "I heard no gunshots, it was just very, very quiet," said Mr. Ketley in an interview with BBC Newsnight. "I could still feel his heart beating, so I thought there might be a chance we could keep him alive. I felt so helpless because I had to watch him die in front of me." A man described as a possible suspect or witness was spotted near the house at 5:50 p.m. on June 24th, 20 minutes after Palmer was found dead. He is described as white, in his early 20s, about 5 feet 10 inches, and of slim build, with short blonde hair and casually dressed in light blue jeans and a light-coloured baggy top. Detectives are also looking to trace 2 or 3 men seen digging a hole in the woodland surrounding Palmer's home at about 11:50 a.m. on June 23rd. Palmer would have a low-key burial in Brentwood. In 2018, police released crime scene photos of the hole in the fence, believed to have been scratched with a nail or other sharp object, which they believed the gunman used to watch his movements, plus a bullet recovered from the scene. Speaking in 2018, Christina said, It haunts us every day to think that whoever was responsible was clearly watching John, stalking him like an animal before so brutally and callously ending his life. Losing a loved one is hard enough, but in this case, we have the added stress of not only not knowing who did it, but why. Marnie said she had given up hope the case would ever be solved, and asserted there was more chance of Lord Lucan showing up than of police finding my John's assassin. A few theories have emerged over the years. Some believe his murder is linked to the Hatton Garden raid, a daring heist that took place 2 months before his death. It's suspected he could have been eliminated to prevent him from revealing the identity of a man known only as Basil, a leading figure in the infamous safe deposit box burglary. Basil was linked to the Adams family, one of the most feared criminal gangs in Britain, who had an interest in a safe deposit box belonging to Palmer. It was said to contain evidence that could implicate them in the killing of a top Gangland figure. After the raid, the box was taken, leaving Palmer without protection. Another theory suggests that Palmer's victims, all 16,000 of them, had a motive to want him dead. Or perhaps, someone from the criminal underworld held a grudge against him for his involvement in numerous armed robberies and missing millions in cash, as to the bullions from the Brinks Mat robbery. Despite the many theories and substantial reward offered by Palmer's family, the killer remains at large. Essex police have gathered intelligence in the UK and abroad, taken hundreds of witness statements, traced vehicles, examined more than 1,400 documents, and pursued over 700 lines of inquiry. Yet, the mystery endures. Cashman had moved from his base in Spain to Dubai after UK police quizzed him in connection with the murder of his former boss, because of a falling out they had over some timeshare properties. Despite suspicions of involvement from both domestic and international criminal networks, no one has ever been charged with Palmer's murder. The key to solving this gruesome crime, as Detective Chief Inspector Stephen Jennings believes, lies within the underworld. As loyalties shift and time passes, someone might now be willing to come forward. He would say in an interview in 2020, 5 years is a long time for John's family to be left without answers, and without anyone facing justice for his cold-blooded murder, he said. In the years since his death, a lot has changed, particularly within the underworld, he continued. We know that Mr. Palmer has always been the subject of scrutiny and speculation, both in the underworld and media, in relation to his connection to organized criminals, specific high-profile crimes, that he was a police informant, and that charges brought against him in Spain were about to be dropped. We cannot comment on the truth of many of these rumours, although Mr. Palmer was still due to stand trial in Spain when he was killed. Over the years, a number of these rumours have been found to be untrue or based wholly in speculation. But if people in the criminal underworld believe them, then it is entirely possible that this led to someone commissioning a professional hit on him. Due to John's significant criminal history, there are people or groups of people who may have wished to do him harm. Therefore, our search is not just for the gunman, but for a person or group of people who may have commissioned the killing. Regardless of Mr. Palmer's past, the reality is that he was much loved by his family, and he was murdered in a calculated, callous killing within the grounds of his own home. It is impossible to imagine how his family must feel without justice and answers, and we continue to do all we can to bring his killer to come forward. We know that the key to solving Mr. Palmer's murder lies within the underworld. Loyalties do change, and people may now feel able to come forward. The prime suspects in this chilling crime are international assassin Imre Arakas, Dublin hitman James Quinn, and another Kinahan shooter from Ireland. Their presence in the UK around the time of the murder places them in the frame. Yet with no concrete evidence, they remain suspects, and the murder of John "GoldFinger" Palmer remains unsolved. Thanks for watching. Follow on Instagram at Official Page of Crime, and also like, comment and subscribe. And hit that bell to stay notified for when new content is released. Until next time, stay safe.